Now, the difficult reality for our culture is that so much of our secularity is post-Christian, and so it's suffused with unacknowledged Christian ways of thinking that are often truncated, distorted, tacit. They have all kinds of mitigations on them. So, which is to say that Breaking Bad is, yes, the universe of it is, if not irreligious, certainly a-religious. Mm-hmm. But the mentality it brings to evil strikes me as recognizably a kind of Christian, as you said, ontology, or a Christian mentality, or a Christian horizon, pick your term.
Welcome to Grail Country. My guest today is Dr. Jonathan Heaps. Jonathan Heaps is the director of the Bernard J. Lonergan Institute at Seton Hall University. And his book, The Ambiguity of Being, Lonergan and the Problems of the Supernatural, was published in 2024 by Catholic University of America Press. Jonathan has published numerous essays on the relationship between embodiment, cognition, and culture, that draw especially on the work of Lonergan and other major figures in the 20th century Catholic thought. His research has appeared in the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly and Theological Studies. Jonathan is currently investigating the role that embodied contemplative practices, such as meditation and mindfulness, could play in addressing the problem of verification in the humanities and in theology. He also writes for a wider audience on a diverse range of topics, from prestige television to political partnership to life during a pandemic. Whether writing for popular or specialized audiences, Jonathan strives to avoid trite framings or prepackaged answers, instead preferring to face the harder version of a problem, even if it means his answers are more complicated or provisional. And with that, welcome to the Grail Country, Jonathan Heaps.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, just as a little more personal introduction, in a more personal way of introduction. So I met Jonathan through a course that he taught through Paul Axton's Forging Plowshares Bible Institute. He taught a kind of introductory course on Lonergan, who I'd never read before. And he tolerated me attempting to understand Lonergan through my evolution of consciousness sort of lens in a way that was quite commendable. And he impressed me as someone who was a good person to talk to. And I had remembered, actually, the reason I signed up for the course in the first place is I had read a piece that he wrote back in 2021 for the Church Life Journal that was entitled Walter White's Chaotic Beauty. And I actually thought it was a really well-written and interesting treatment of some of the nuances of thinking through the ontology of evil. And so that's what I proposed to talk to him about today, was to come in here and discuss his thoughts about the ontology of evil. And I think starting from that popular culture lens will make it really relatable for people. And so starting with some of the ideas that Jonathan developed in that piece might be a good way to start. And then we also discussed the possibility of talking about how to think about the psychologizing of malevolence, and whether that's ultimately a good move or a bad move for us to make as Christians, and how we should think about that, and how that connects to the ontology of evil. And he said he was prepared to talk about that too. So those are the two things I proposed to talk to you about today. So welcome, Jonathan. Well, I'm so glad to have you with me on Grail Country.
Let's get evil.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Walter White piece, I want to make a couple of observations of things. You kind of look at Walter White through the lens of the sinner. Mm-hmm. And I think but there's a couple other insights that I would like to bring to it, which you may or may not share, but I think may be relevant. And one of them is that, yeah, Walter White is a sinner, but he also seems to me to be intentionally connected to Milton's Satan, because his primary motivation is a sense of inward merit. Because of the whole gray matters thing. It's he feels that what he's going after, he deserves it. that the world has mistreated him. He's just getting, and he's resentful, and he's just getting what he rightfully deserves. So there's that kind of like diabolical kind of motivation that allows for the slide to happen in the first place. And then the other thing that that I wanted to mention is that in terms of form, Breaking Bad appears to me to be a Western, and a dark Western, but a Western nonetheless, which is why it ends the way it does.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, Walter White, despite his flaws, ends up doing the redemptive violence on behalf of the community. He has to die, and at the end, in that story, you either have to be exiled or die.
Right.
At the end of the story,
or a la Shane, both.
Yeah, right. Where you leave the ambiguity is like, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, Shane is the perfect Western, I think, because of that.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we're on the same page. You get
good. I think that's nice. Look, at some point, I saw this in an interview, and I should have tucked it away somewhere, but at some point, Vince Gilligan said he explicitly considers Breaking Bad to be a narrative meditation. I don't know if these are his words exactly, but the gist of it was that he considered it a narrative meditation on sin and evil in I don't know if he said post, but he definitely said non-religious frame. Mm-hmm. Now, the difficult reality for our culture is that so much of our secularity is post-Christian, and so it's suffused with unacknowledged Christian ways of thinking, right, that are often truncated, distorted, tacit. They have all kinds of mitigations on them. So, which is to say that Breaking Bad is, yes, the universe of it is, if not irreligious, certainly a-religious. Mm-hmm. But the mentality it brings to evil strikes me as recognizably a kind of Christian, as you said, ontology, or a Christian mentality, or a Christian horizon, pick your term. And so, yeah, part and parcel of that is as the narrative unfolds, what does it turn out is Walt's primary sin? What's the sort of core moral failure? It's pride.
Yep.
And he's willing to sacrifice everything on the altar of his pride. And not only that, it's specifically it's a pride that is born out of resentment. Like that's like, which is the kind of pride that quite easily leads us to justify the most horrible things. All kinds of bad behavior. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, and if you want to get Augustinian in other ways too, right, you can make sense of why, right, Walt's a capable guy, obviously, right? So many of the narrative arcs in the episodes are about Walt backing himself into some horrible corner and getting himself out through his scientific knowledge, his engineering creativity, etc. So there's a genuine good there, and but like you said, out of his resentful pride, he elevates that above everything else, right? And so when there's a scene where Jesse is like, we have the opportunity to make more money than we could ever need if we just sell the methylamine we stole, and we can both just walk off into the sunset. Walt's like, you fundamentally misunderstand what I'm in this for. Right. And all, I don't know if your listeners / viewers are familiar with the work of the liberation theologian Ignacio Ellacuría, but he's got a lovely essay called "The Crucified People," and he makes a note in there of the way in which the language of bearing the sins of the world, he articulates how so often other people bear the consequences of someone else's sin.
Right. Yeah.
He's looking at social structures, right, where powerful people, to protect their interests, are willing to do wrong in a way that afflicts other people to their own benefit.
Right.
But you see it.
Yeah, I know, and power can have the effect of insulating you from the consequences of your own sin, while others suffer the consequences of it.
Or if you like medieval scholastic distinctions, there's the distinction between malum culpae, culpable evil, and malum pene, the evil of punishment. And oftentimes our imagination of how that distinction operates is that the evil of punishment follows upon the evil of culpable evil, a sort of per se moral evil. And we think of that as something that you do something bad and something bad happens to you. But unfortunately, most of the time in our world, you do something bad and something bad happens to somebody else. Which we can put a flag in sort of the way in which evil and cosmic order are related there, right? That evil has reverberations through the cosmic order, and that's part of why culpable evil in my individual person can have these knock-on effects in terms of malum pene for other people.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it's actually easy for us to see those effects when they come from evil, but those same kinds of outward rippling effects happen from the good as well, but they're harder for us to see. Why do you think that is?
Part of it is that the good is this is going to be very gnomic at first, but hopefully I can unpack it adequately. The good is normative, which means that depending on which perspective you take, the good can be just what's supposed to happen. Right.
That's good. So it's like the reason we don't notice it is because it's not out of sorts.
Right. No one comes to my door and gives me a wreath or laurels every time I make my kids a meal.
Right.
Even though I'm doing the obligatory good, right? Which is you got to feed your kids.
And even though something like that, it's a simple good like that really does have as much a rippling effect as evils do. It's just that. But I think you're right. It's the fact that the good functions as the normative that makes it just kind of it just fades into the background.
Right. And so that becomes a matter of, in that essay I wrote, I haven't done much work with Hans Urs von Balthasar in the intervening few years, but when I wrote that, I was sort of toying with some of his ideas. And I'm friends with Ann Carpenter, who's a very serious Balthasar scholar. And so she was sort of helping me read him well. And there's a German way of speaking about apprehension of the truth, which is about a kind of perception of its trueness, Wahrnehmen. And so, part of one's spirituality can be an ongoing, daily, hourly exercise in trying to see the way in which the world in its normal unfolding is an expression of the glory of God's goodness.
Absolutely. That's hard. I just had Esther Lightcap Meek on the channel to talk about her book Doorway to Artistry, which is her first philosophical book that deals with metaphysics. She's always written on epistemology before, and her exploration of the real is very focused on the way in which the ground of reality itself, God, is present in the normal everyday things. Mm-hmm. So
my book's about that too, only differently. My book is about, Lonergan has this funny line in his, he turned his dissertation, I can't remember if this line is in the dissertation or if he turned it into a series of theological studies articles, which were later compiled into a book. But anyway, the book is called Grace and Freedom. Mm-hmm. And the critical edition has both the the journal articles and the dissertation. And I can't remember if this is in the dissertation or the journal articles, but he says, in debates about grace and debates about God's providence and human freedom, there's this funny tendency of everyone to assume that they know what words like operate, cause, cooperate all mean. And he says, this kind of ingenious assumption means that the debates tend to happen in a way that neglects fundamental questions. And so my book is, I was going to say superficially, I hope it's not superficial in any regard, but facially about the natural supernatural debates. But a lot of the page count is about getting into these deeper questions about Aquinas's theory of agency and of causation and of cooperation between divine agency and human agency. And very quickly, what you realize in Thomas's account, at least as read by Lonergan, is that God acts in every created action. And so everything that isn't moral failure is God at work in the world. Right. Now, the titular ambiguity...
Everything that's not explicitly a denial of cooperation is cooperation.
Right.
I would say is another way of putting that. That cooperation is kind of the default, and you have to actually actively resist against it.
And someone like Maurice Blondel is going to say, and even the act of deciding to resist it is a kind of using of God's agency against God. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it evil. I mean, that's what makes it...
Right, exactly.
That's what makes it have eternal consequences. Right. Because you implicate the eternal in that temporal decision. So we can talk more about that later if you want. But the point I was going to get to is that but because everything, the normal unfolding of everything is an expression of the glory of God's goodness, or if you like, an action taken by God in the world, everything can have a kind of ambiguous significance now because, well, let's talk about it in terms of creatio ex nihilo. If God's creation is not this kind of deistic thing that happened back in some primordial time, but is instead God's continuing action and causing and sustaining reality, then the difference that God's action makes in creation is a difference only from nothing. Mm-hmm. And you can reasonably ask whether a difference from nothing is any difference at all. And the ambiguity is, on the one hand, it's the biggest difference that's possible because it's a difference between there being something and there being nothing. But you can also very reasonably say, well, yeah, but now that there is something, is God's action a matter of indifference because it's the only thing it's different from is nothing? And I get in a little bit into how this sort of in a modern frame creates sort of possibilities for atheism and et cetera, et cetera. But it goes to the same thing, right? Which is that spirituality then becomes a kind of cultivation of seeing everything in its eternal valence. Mm-hmm. And as I said quickly before, that's hard.
Yeah.
It takes practice.
Yeah. That's great. So in the piece that you wrote, you kind of explore like why it is that we sympathize with, I mean, most people who I think maybe except for my son never really did, but most people who watch Breaking Bad sympathize with Walter White to some degree, or they wouldn't keep watching the show, right? And lots of people watch the show and be captivated by the show and find themselves, despite the conflictedness that it might lead to, rooting for Walter White.
Why, when he gets himself into these jams, do we feel anxious?
Right.
Why are we like, oh man, I hope he gets out of it this time? It wouldn't like any like any morally sensitive person, you would hope would go, oh, finally they're going to stop this maniac.
Right.
Right. But no, like the way the narrative is structured, that's not the response you have. The response you have is like, oh, I hope he gets away.
Yeah.
It's in some ways it's like it's a big question. It's a little bit baffling. And when
Right.
that show was on, there were all kinds of these anti-hero, I never watched it, but like Dexter was one.
Oh yeah.
And there was a whole series of these anti-hero prestige television things. Right. You watch Mad Men and it's like, do you or don't you want Don to get caught cheating on his wife?
Right.
And sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. And
right.
What is happening there?
Yeah.
It's very strange.
Right. So why do you have what's your working theory as to why do we sympathize with Walter?
I mean, some of it, I think you can be of two minds about it.
Okay.
Right? Because I think some of it can be, you could be Plato or Plato's Socrates and say, see, this is why you can't trust poets. Poets with the music of their language and the sort of structuring of their mythos, they'll get you to root for all kinds of morally questionable stuff.
Right.
I think probably there's something to that.
Right.
Right. That's a part of it. Part of it is rhetorical. But I think there's a deeper dynamic, at least to the extent that those shows have artistic merit, which uncovers or discloses, to use a kind of Heideggerian idiom, the way in which human evil is not the end of our story.
Right.
That in the unfolding, in the dramatic unfolding,
that if there weren't the implicit possibility of redemption, that we would never get caught up in these storylines in the first place. If we really thought that the character was irredeemably evil,
yeah,
we wouldn't find ourselves in that place where it's like we're simultaneously repulsed by them and rooting for them.
Right. If drug and alcohol addiction had a 100% mortality rate,
right,
we would never make dramas about the experience of addicted people.
That's why I think you're right in the beginning when we talked about it. It's like, the creator may have intended it to be religiously neutral or post-Christian or whatever, but it actually ends up being a Christian pattern of storytelling anyway because of that redemptive element. And I think we remain a Christian culture on a very deep level, and the fact that we continue to enjoy those kinds of narratives is a sign that regardless of what we might say in our intellectual propositions, there's something that still has a hold of us.
Yeah, and I think you can run that analysis both directions too, right?
Sure.
So on one level, you can say, yeah, there's this kind of residue of the momentum of Christian, for one thing, Christian civilization in the form of Christendom, which has pretty well collapsed. But also this kind of, the long tail of a Christian culture, of a Christianized culture, if you like. Yeah. So you can run it that way, but you can run it the other direction too, which is just that, look, in this regard, Christianity said something true about the moral structure of reality.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now,
but it's pretty hard to find. Without something, it's pretty hard to find anything to ground that in if you're not making a claim that is a religious claim, right?
Oh,
so
sure.
It's like, based on what would you say that it comports with reality? Because I would say, like, from a purely materialist account of reality, it doesn't appear that way at all.
Oh, I don't know. Not everyone dies of drug addiction.
Right.
the moral. So I invoke Saint Athanasius is on the incarnation in that article,
Mm-hmm.
and Athanasius says, "Look, and he's operating in a Platonic, or at least a Neoplatonic metaphysical frame,
Right.
right? And so what sin does is it introduces corruption. Now we hear corruption, we think of it in proceduralist terms. We think of corruption as the violation of normative rules. Viewers and listeners can think of their own examples from current events if they wish. But in the ancient world, corruption was a biological metaphor. It was about decomposition,
Right,
disintegration.
right.
And so, Athanasius's metaphor for sin and its consequences is essentially, he says, okay, biological things die and then they decompose. What happens to spiritual beings is that once sin enters their reality, they decompose unto spiritual death. They disintegrate unto spiritual death, and that has a kind of, to me, it has a theological valence insofar as the integrating order of the spiritual being is received directly from God. He talks about the impress of the word, this kind of signet ring thing that happens to us when we're created. But the actual dynamics of that are, I think, sort of empirical. Like if you know somebody who's really just kind of given themselves over to their base desires and their base instincts, and they just have stopped trying to be a responsible person, what do you see happen in their life? Mm-hmm. Their life falls apart. And it happens, it happens slowly at first, and then all of a sudden, it's a kind of, what's the golden ratio? What's that thing called? Right. That has that kind of,
right.
It's tighter and faster. And
that's John Vervaeke calls that process reciprocal narrowing,
mm-hmm.
which is like, that's what's involved in addiction, for example.
Yeah. Your world gets small, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But again, I think as an empirical matter, that death spiral, whether it's happening to an individual person or whether it's happening to a whole civilization,
mm-hmm.
doesn't result in annihilation in every instance. Mm-hmm. There's a residue of cases, and a not insignificant residue of cases, in which somehow people and communities,
right? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk. Yeah, but let's. Okay. I've dealt with people that have struggled with addiction to a fair amount, and most of them, there's something like what gets them out of that spiral is an encounter with some kind of spirituality of some kind. Like there's no, like,
as I understand it, they very commonly report something outside of me.
Right.
Even if it's just the people who
go power greater than myself in the AA formulation, right? So, I mean, so it doesn't like, so there, that is, to me, that is like, you're thinking about being in a different way.
Yeah. No, it changes.
That is no longer pure. It's not really purely materialist.
No, it's
thinking about it in that way. So which was what I was trying to say.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Which is like,
I would want to make a distinction then between, so I certainly agree. No, it can't be purely materialist, right?
I'm not saying it has to be Christian. What I'm saying is that
okay, so that was what I was backing against a little bit.
No, not at all. No.
But
my wife's Jewish. I'm definitely not saying that.
Okay, good. And I'm a Catholic beholden to Nostra Aetate, so I can't get away with that stuff either. Okay. But yeah, I do think that there is. I was having a conversation over dinner with someone about this a few weeks ago. That, so I mean, to use addiction as an example again, right? At least my understanding of the physiology of it is that the part of your neurology that disease hijacks is one concerned with survival. And so no, you decreasingly associate healthy behaviors with survival, and you associate doing the behavior again or using the substance again with survival. And so deep physiological experiences. If I don't drink or if I don't get high or whatever, gamble, I'm going to die.
Right.
Well, what wouldn't you do?
Right.
If you thought, and the behavior of addicts bears that out, right? What's in recovery circles?
Right, because you've reduced your entire existence to just this thing because you've made it so important.
Yeah, because it's associated with staying alive.
Yeah.
And so they talk about, when you're hitting bottom is, what's the language they use of your circumstances deteriorate faster than you can lower your standards.
Mm-hmm.
But that indicates the kind of process at work.
Yeah.
And
which is like, what's interesting too, because that's the title of we started this talking about Breaking Bad, right? Well, that's right there on the title. It's telling you, it's an understanding that this is a process, right? It's not just like, which actually is, that's a good transition point to talk about the other thing that we wanted to talk about, because in Breaking Bad, it's a story of someone breaking bad. It's like, Walter White isn't born as like an absolute embodiment of evil. Oh. He has this sin in him that causes him to gradually slide deeper and deeper into sin.
Right.
And the story does have a kind of enough of a redemptive element to keep us rooting for him. Right.
Yeah.
But what do we make when we start to talk about, like, and specifically, I've been thinking about the way sociopathy and psychopathy are talked about, particularly when they start to pick up a political valence like they have lately.
Yeah.
I find that concerning, because there's something about that like when you start talking about it in terms of that, I'm wondering where you're leaving room for grace or redemption.
Yeah.
When you start talking about it in those terms. What are your? But at the same time, it's like as long as that doesn't mean if that means for you an illness for which we can seek healing, and not like something just that is biologically essential to that person, then maybe okay. But I think we need to think carefully about how we talk about it.
No, I hear you.
Risk of just taking grace and redemption out of the picture altogether.
And I was just about to add a caveat, which is we've been sliding back and forth between kinds of examples, and I wouldn't want people to hear me giving addiction as an example of moral evil.
Right.
Right. I'm fully on board with the disease model. We have really good neurological models for kind of the physiological piece of how it unfolds. And one of the
well, it's also like as Christians, right? There's like viewing sin as an illness is a very traditional thing to do.
Totally. So, but I'm also Thomist enough that I like fine distinctions. And so, one of the things that an emergentist metaphysics can give you is it can let you differentiate the elements in complex human problems. So that even if there is a physiology operative or a psychology operative, there is also a spiritual element that's involved too, because there's a whole person who's involved in the situation that's emerged. Let me switch examples radically.
Okay, go for
it. From these kind of ones that are involved physiology. When I moved to Milwaukee to go to Marquette, Milwaukee is a place like lots of northern kind of, post-industrial cities where in the midst of the Great Migration of African Americans into these northern cities, they imposed, draconian racial segregation in these cities. And Milwaukee is regularly listed as one of the most racially segregated cities in America.
I did not know that and would not have guessed it.
Yeah. When I used to teach there, I would teach King's Letter from Birmingham Jail, and he would talk about Birmingham being one of the most segregated cities in America. And I would say to my students, do you know what one of the most segregated cities in America is today? And inevitably one student would go, the one we're in? I'd be like, yep. And if you're sensitive to it at all, you see it in the infrastructure of the city. I mean, it's etched into that city, the racial segregation. It's not quite as linear as Chicago, where it's kind of north side, south side, but it's like very visible. And there's a way in which if you're someone who is born into that place, setting aside the cultural attitudes of the people you interact with, just the physical infrastructure of the city induces a segregated sociality into your way of being in the place you're from. And so we used to talk, me and some other graduate students at Marquette used to talk about a kind of social concupiscence, that you had no agency in the city being set up that way, right? It happened decades before you were born. You were well before the age of reason while this was having an effect on your sociality and your psychology and all these things. And nevertheless, it can prime you to do things, to treat people with less than their full infinite dignity on the basis of their race, which is a sin. And so the language that I like to use around this when I'm talking to my students is something can be not your fault and still be your responsibility.
Right.
So let's switch back to the psychological examples. I think part of being a person is, with all the caveats being made about particular circumstances, people can be deprived of the things they need to realize this by other people. But with a certain amount of necessary scaffolding, part of becoming an adult is appropriating the limitations and the deformations that weren't your fault, but now you're an adult and they're your responsibility. And you got to do something about it, or if you don't, your failure to take responsibility for it, you're morally culpable for that.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's like, I think that if Christians, if we find ourselves in a position where we find ourselves often saying it's not my problem, that I think that we're going very astray.
Yeah,
because we very much are each other's problems.
Right? Am I my brother's keeper? Who said that?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, I'm totally with you there. Yeah, for sure.
And so I tend to think of those kinds of psychological things in that neighborhood. That that those are things that as you become an adult, it's incumbent upon you to do some of the work to notice the symptoms and to take responsibility for managing and mitigating that. And it might mean that that's the part of your moral life that's harder than someone else's.
Well, yeah, it's like that also brings to mind for me the way in which sometimes we fail to take seriously enough the way in which the church is a family, and that we call each other brother and sister for a reason.
Yep. And
that they're when you have a chance to interact with people that a lot of not necessarily there are some mental illnesses that have biological causes, obviously, but there's a lot of mental illness that is actually just a result of people having not been parented well growing up, not being properly loved by their mother and father. And I do think it's very much the responsibility of the church to reparent those people. So it may actually fall on, if you're fortunate enough to come into contact with someone who is struggling and trying to rebuild their lives, then as much as you can help reperson them in a more productive way, that's actually your job. That's Vervaeke's really good on this, because he talks about how agape is specifically the kind of love that forms persons.
Yeah.
Right? And if we as Christians we're supposed to be living agape out into the world, and making persons, there's a mode of that is brotherly, sisterly, but there's also a mode of that is parental, where it's where you have someone who maybe has learned less of the wisdom of life that you can help and you can mentor and guide. You have a responsibility to do that.
Look, I'm Catholic. We call our pastors father.
Right, exactly. I think that's why, by the way. I think that's why.
Right. And, speaking biographically, part of the reason the addiction metaphors are powerful to me is because there's a lot of it in the history of my family. And a lot of my great-grandparents were catastrophic alcoholics. And my grandparents mostly managed not to fall into active disease. I'm sure they had all the genetic load for it, but they on my dad's side, they did it by becoming like just good teetotaling Baptist folk. So they dealt with it, but just like, we're just not going to touch the stuff. And, were my dad's parents like super great parents in terms of providing psychological and emotional scaffolding for my dad? I like to say he was gently neglected. But they did better than their parents.
Right.
And my parents, in turn, found resources to do better than their parents did. Mm-hmm. And part of that actually was, in my parents' case, is that they found a church community. I didn't grow up Catholic. I grew up in the Evangelical Covenant Church.
Right.
They found a church community where...
By the way, that's so like that is like the norm for most of the theologians I talk to.
Oh, really?
A lot of the theologians I talk to are have that story. That's true of Jordan Wood. That's true of Roberto de la Naval. Like that's a common story. Like these Catholic theologians your age who started off as somewhere in the evangelical world.
Yeah, we could maybe talk about the biographies, the biographical parts of that, because it's an interesting thing. But the landing point of that narrative was, I had a church community where I had really healthy, robust relationships with adults who weren't my parents, who cared about me becoming a whole, healthy, good person.
Yep.
And whatever things, and I don't know how self-consciously my parents did that, but in retrospect, whatever they kind of didn't have in their bag of parental tricks, they managed to find a community where different people with different backgrounds and different gifts and different limitations could also be involved in my formation. And there's a version of the story where I'm alive because that happened, and might not have been otherwise. So anyway, which is just to say, I fully recognize the point you're making very concretely in my own biography.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes, like, I don't know why I'm thinking in these terms, but maybe it's because my wife is Jewish. But I'm wondering if like when we talk about law and spirit, and we put those things in opposition, I wonder if a better way to think in it would be like the law alone is insufficient, and what spirit reflects is the communal wisdom to actually implement the law and practice the law.
If I drop into my well-worn Thomist gear, Thomas says over and over and over again, true and false are in the mind, but the good is in things. Lonergan will often say the good is concrete.
Right.
And what that means is that laws or moral precepts or what have you, I'm sorry for our audiophile listeners. I was relegated to my basement for this. So if you hear the pipe noise going, I'm sorry about that. But that's why the Soviet...
It reminds us of the real.
Indeed. It's very concrete. In fact,
yeah, exactly.
But part of what it means that the good is concrete is that moral precepts are going to be abstract. Mm-hmm. And now the benefit of their abstraction is it gives them wide generality. They can be relevant to a wide swath of experiences and circumstances. But what this means in terms of pivoting from the abstractness of moral laws or moral rules or moral precepts to the concreteness of the good is that you have to practice prudence. You have to practice practical reasoning. You have to have, in Lonergan's language, you have to have that at least one further insight into the relationship between this abstract moral principle or moral rule or law and these concrete circumstances that I know.
Well, I think that's why Jesus says, "I am the truth." Is he's pointing directly away from that abstraction and pointing us back toward his concrete embodied existence. So. Yep.
And so then, so I always forget his name, and I feel bad because his work is really good. But there's a guy who's a psychologist of sort of adolescent neuropsychology, and he has this whole model. I think about this a lot as a college professor, right? Because I have the preponderance of the students in my classrooms are people between the ages of 18 and 24, and they're all in that period where their prefrontal cortices are closed for remodeling. And so their executive functioning isn't great.
Right.
And we do this weird thing as a culture where we're like, go, become an adult. And then we put all these 19-year-olds in big buildings with almost no adults.
Yeah.
And like, I'm Aristotelian enough to know that's a bad idea.
Right.
So this psychologist, again, whose name I can't think of, I want to say it's Siegel, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I apologize to him if he's listening. He has this model where through body-to-body, very subtle nonverbal communication and attunement, adolescents of the age where this prefrontal cortex is closed for remodeling are kind of able to borrow the fully functioning brain of the adults in their life. They're able to have access to the physiological substrate of good decision making, not in their body, but in the adults.
Oh, okay.
And so, I think about, now again, there's a whole other set of psychodynamic and then spiritual dynamics that are nested on top of that physiological point. But I do think it's informative to think about, if you want holistic, integrated, concrete ways of addressing moral formation, you do have to think about the fact that, like, in human beings in this life, all the spiritual stuff happens in and through our bodies, at the site of our bodies.
Well, yeah, and we participate in a larger body that is beyond the confines of our body as well.
That's right.
So, yeah.
And so, I think that has to be taken really seriously. And as much as I am not at all technophobic, as much as I have, as Eddie Izzard says, techno joy, I'm often an early adopter. I worry about the highly digitally mediated experience, social experiences that people younger than me have. Because I worry about the way in which their embodiment is disintegrated from that. So it's part of, you read that kind of intro bio stuff, and it's part of where the embodiment thing kicks in is, I'm very sensitive to the way in which the high spiritual capacities of the human always have these kind of pylons that run deep down into our embodiment. And the spiritual can get real wobbly if that embodied piece is neglected, to spin out a weird metaphor.
All right, so that's all great, but what do you think we should actually do as a society or as Christians? How should we think about the phenomenon of sociopathy and psychopathy?
I mean, you can listen to podcast interviews with people who meet the psychological criteria for psychopathy, who've led totally productive, relatively normal lives. The people who often become dangerous, especially dangerous as psychopaths. I mean, psychopaths will engage in risky behavior and impulsive behavior, and they'll be sometimes manipulative of other people, but very rarely does it rise to the sort of movie and TV level of sort of scary monster stuff.
Right. Well, that's my precise. I'm glad you said that, the monster thing too, because that's the thing. It's like, that's my concern about it, is like, when we start particularly when we start bringing that discussion into the political frame, which we already have an alarming cultural tendency to dehumanize each other to begin with. When we start talking about it in terms of sociopathy and psychopathy, then it becomes very easy to just completely dehumanize.
And so Now, one of the things that was I'm not a psychologist, so this is all secondhand from me just being a nerd who's interested in this
No, if
stuff.
I thought, well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the psychologists don't have all the answers, and maybe they should bring the theologians into the picture.
But and I'm a Lonerganian, so I like the idea of intellectual collaboration and interdisciplinarity. So I'm pretty free with the stuff, but it's good to put these caveats.
My friend John Vervaeke has said that in the way that we're moving right now, we've entered a place where the theologians need to be brought back into the discussion. So
yeah, fair enough.
There you go.
Okay. I think one thing that can take people into that really scary space is untreated trauma, right? Someone who has the neurological and psychological deficiency with regard to empathy that a psychopath does, what can take them from just being someone who drives their car too fast and is sometimes manipulative in business negotiations to being someone who cuts people up and puts them in their fridge is trauma, especially in the form of adverse childhood experience.
Yeah.
And so, when parishes and churches do the mandated reporter training and stuff, like that's not just a legal butt covering exercise. That's a real ministry to make sure that young people are safe and can grow up to be whole adults who don't need profound psychological and medical intervention.
I'm not saying this to pick on Catholics, and I'm a very Anglo-Catholic leaning Anglican, so I'm not at all anti-Catholic. But I wonder, like from a Catholic perspective, thinking about what you're saying right now, how much a reckoning with the sexual abuse crisis in the church, a real reckoning with that, is required for everyone's healing.
140%.
Yeah.
A mathematically nonsensical amount. It just has to happen. In some ways, there's nothing else to be said, right? It's so fundamental. And yet it's so fraught that
it's not, and it's also, let's be fair now too, it's also not a phenomenon that is unique to Catholicism by any stretch of the imagination.
No. I take my son to Boy Scout meetings on Tuesday nights. Yeah. I'm aware of that. This happens elsewhere. But I mean, you have like I was talking about, the sort of scaffolding of layers of the human person. Human communities are the same way. And institutional and legal and cultural and interpersonal, right? That's the kind of thing you have to go after in all those strata of your ecclesial community. Anyway, I can't say it strong enough, so I'll just stop trying. So that's one piece. But I do think you make a good point too, though, about none of these, even if someone lives decades not taking responsibility for their mental illness or psychological malformations, or however you want to talk about it, there's nowhere else to begin but where you are, is one thing. Mm-hmm. And it is always available to you to do so. This is one of the things that I think contemplative practice can help teach us. This is something actually that who I mentioned before, my friend Anne Carpenter brings out nicely in her treatment of, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name. The French poet from whom the term ressourcement comes from. Anyway, I can't think of the guy's name, but she gives this lovely treatment of the guy where the term ressourcement comes from also talks about revolution. And the way he thinks about revolution is the capacity to begin again. That whatever blind alley you've gone down, it is available to you with the resources you have up to this point, to begin anew. And I take that in some ways to be the essence of contemplative practice. Mm-hmm. I heard a guy who studied Zen Buddhism say once, getting distracted isn't bad. Not noticing you've become distracted is bad. and that part of what that contemplative practice is about is a returning to the attention and intention of the present moment. And I think that is the kernel at the core of all spiritual practice and development in life. Is it is possible because the mind is in potency anything. It can wander all over the place and get into all kinds of gnarly places, but it is always part of what it is to be a spiritual being is in time and space, is that it is always available to you to stop, to notice that you've been inattentive or incurious or irrational or irresponsible or callous and without love and kindness and compassion, and to begin again. And to have the humility that when you begin again, I'm Aristotelian enough to believe in habit. And so you might be bad at it at first. And so you have to practice. And often it means actually that you might need to submit yourself to a master or a director or a guide of some kind, a pastor, a leader of some kind. And that to me is really the thing that, to circle back to pride, right, is, and this functions in terms of gender, it functions in terms of race. There are parts of our community that are primed to think that by dint of the accident of their sex or the accident of their racial characteristics, that they deserve to be in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And recovery often.
By the way, I just want to point out real quick that cuts all ways in the dialogues over those issues too, because that gets used by the majority against the interest of the minority, and it also gets used in a minority move that's just seeking to flip the hierarchy and has no interest in actual reconciliation.
Oh, sure. I mean, I do think that there can be a way in which one really only thinks about these things in terms of the acquisition of power,
right?
And if that's the case, then we're already in hell.
Oh, and I hate to say it, but it looks like that's where we're politically. That looks like straight where we're headed.
Could be.
It is exactly that kind of like war of identity groups against each other, perpetually seeking power, and it's very sad for me to watch.
Yeah, and I think. But to go back to my point about sort of spiritual practice, what holds for the individual spirit holds too for the spirit of a community. That it is always available to us as a community to stop and to notice.
Yeah.
And
also the other thing though that I just want to point out, which actually ties into what we were just talking about. So in order to give people the space to be able to stop and notice and begin again, we have to value forgiveness to give the space for that to happen. We just do. If we give up on forgiveness as a core value because we're seeking vengeance against whoever we think has wronged us for whatever reason they think they've wronged us, then we feed into the same kind of resentment that drove Walter White. Right.
So let's go back to the ontology of evil.
Okay. Let's do.
Because Lonergan had an insight. Lonergan was very interested. Lonergan finished his undergraduate studies and went back to a Canada that was devastated by the Great Depression. And then a few years later, he was sent to Rome in the 33, 34 time period. So, right. Height of fascist.
Beginning of the rise of fascism, yeah.
And was watching the Second World War kind of become more, kind of gather on the horizon. And even before that, he had been very interested in the philosophy of history, but became much more interested, obviously, out of these experiences. And his philosophy of history is really an ontology of the good. And for Lonergan, and he found a way of thinking about this in the writings of St. Thomas. The good is an adequate account of the good is not just given in two terms. Now, look, good and evil are real opposites.
Mm-hmm.
There's a real dialectical choice, a real dialectical difference between good and evil. And the truth of that opposition will sometimes lead people to think only in terms of good and evil. And the good is that which is obligatory, and evil is that which you must not do and avoid, and so forth. But forgiveness creates a kind of a problem, or it can. Because if forgiveness is good and so obligatory, but the circumstances of forgiveness have as their condition someone doing evil to you, well, now you have a weird moral conundrum where now I am obliged morally, in fact, I owe forgiveness as a good act towards the person who victimized me. That makes me morally itchy.
Mm-hmm.
Lonergan thinks the temporal unfolding of the good is not explained just in two opposed terms, but in three terms: progress or development,
mm-hmm.
decline or sin, and redemption. And which means that the good is realized in history in two ways. And if you are scholastically minded, you can map natural onto development and supernatural onto redemption. Where supernatural means you have two orders of the good, which are, one is disproportionate to the other. And so feeding my kids is good, and forgiving someone who wrongs me is good, but they're good in different orders of the good.
Mm-hmm.
So they're good in different ways.
Right.
And my relationship to them as good is different. And so, just as an aside, Lonergan is a big math and science nerd, as anyone who picks up Insight will discover very quickly. And he was inspired for this model of the good as three unfolding terms in history by Newton's account of the perturbed ellipses of planetary orbits.
Oh, interesting.
Because you need three different mathematical approximations to give the full explanations, right? You need a spherical orbit, and then you need to account for the elliptical transformation of the circular orbit, the elliptical transformation of that, and then the perturbance of the ellipse by the gravity of the relative objects. That was his inspiration for his philosophy of history.
That's good. That's a good analogy to start from, because it casts your mind immediately into the mode of thinking as things in active motion, as opposed to like a static whiteboard problem,
right?
Which is going to give you a more robust thinking.
And so when you make distinctions between the way in which forgiveness is good and the way in which feeding my kids is good, right? You're able to recognize that these are distinctions being made within a dynamic, a unitary dynamic whole of a process. And it helps get you out of the kind of two-tier thinking that so many people in the 20th century reacted against because of their formation in this kind of scholastic seminaries of the late 19th and early 20th century. But right, it is always a danger, right, that you can kind of you can overread the distinctions as separations. So that's always a kind of, you can't get out of that being a risk. That just comes with making distinctions, I think. Yeah. But to your point, the analogy from astronomical mathematics helps you see the way in which, it's just one concrete process, and we're using our minds to delineate the elements at play in the process. And so when we talk about a show like Breaking Bad, right, we're able to then get a little more clarity about, okay, so Walt was able to develop these really good skills in chemistry and in biology. There was some kind of rupture that caused him to fall into decline. both sort of in terms of his lying fallow for a long time, but then in his efforts to try and recover his abilities and expression of his abilities, the way in which his pride and resentment make sort of turn the skills he developed on the good, right? Now he's super powered to do a lot of damage because he's got,
and he even ends up damaging the things that he wanted to protect.
right?
Like his family. He ends up tearing his family apart, even though when he begins,
that's putatively what he's doing it for.
Exactly, because he knows he's going to die because he has cancer, that's terminal cancer, and so his motivation is to provide for his family. And by as it spirals out of control, he loses even that, and it starts to turn against the family that he sought to protect.
And so then, right, Norm Macdonald did a tweet, a thread on Twitter.
I was thinking of that like a little bit
a million years ago, where his hypothesis is it doesn't make any sense.
Versus the good. Is that the one?
Norm's a spiritual guy, identified as a Christian.
Yeah.
Complicated dude.
Yeah.
Also an addict, a gambling addict. But he goes, "There's no way Walt makes this turn to go try to make things right in the last part of the last season."
Right.
After he sees himself, he sees the news story in the bar in Maine, and he goes and he sits in the car. Right.
Yeah.
He goes, Walt just sits in the car, freezes to death, and that whole last sequence is a kind of wish fulfillment.
Oh, gotcha.
Psychologically was Norm's hypothesis. Read on it.
Right.
And I love Norm Macdonald, and that's very clever, but I hate it.
Oh, I thought you were going to reference his tweet, which I was thinking about earlier in our conversation. He had a tweet once about where he has a take on evil, where he said he basically was criticizing like basically all conversation about good versus evil. He said all I see is good versus good. Oh,
interesting. I missed that one. I hadn't seen that. I mean, we've all seen his reply to Neil deGrasse Tyson about us being the universe that cares about itself or something. But no, I really didn't like that. I think that in that last part, we see Walt, who's been in this spiral of getting more violent, more callous, and his life falls apart accordingly, right? Very much the way Athanasius would suggest. Mm-hmm. That he starts to he starts to resist the momentum of that moral abnegation, and he tries to go make things right. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very instructive that the way he tries to go and make things right isn't great.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't work with his family at all. It involves murdering a bunch of people. Now,
but it really is
pathetic people, but people nonetheless. And extorting is, it's not great, but it's headed in the other direction.
Right.
There's a periagoge.
Yeah, there's a way where okay, so the idea of might for right is an improvement on might for might, right?
Yeah.
It is it is on the arc of moral improvements. But it isn't the end state we're hoping for.
No, yeah, we would hope for more development, but it's a step. Lonergan has a great line where he says, he's talking about authenticity and inauthenticity as a human person. Yeah. And he says, most of the time our authenticity takes the form of just a withdrawal from inauthenticity. Mm-hmm. Most of the time we're just trying to be less inauthentic. Because we dig ourselves this hole. One way of thinking about original sin is as a kind of descriptive account or a symbolic account of the fact that we kind of inevitably start in a moral hole that we get first thing to do. The first rule of holes: stop digging.
Right. But we have a very deep-seated impulse to respond to the to evil thinking that coercion and violence are our only responses available.
What are you going to do? These evil people are irrational and irresponsible, and they won't listen to Lonergan has another great line in an essay called I think it's in the Dialectic of Authority, an essay in this volume called The Second Collection. All of Lonergan's essay collections are very creatively titled. There's collection, there's a second collection, and a third collection.
Beautiful.
Rene Girard, he was not in the title department. But he says, there's no use appealing to the responsibility of irresponsible people, the rationality of irrational people, the intelligence of people committed to being obtuse. And he says, what does he say about to the attentiveness of people who attend only to their grievances? Like, you have to take another route. There has to be another procedure. And at that point, he talks about God's grace.
Right.
I did want to make one other comment, because I've written for Church Life Journal about another pop culture prestige television show, which is Deadwood.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let's.
I have an essay.
I also love Deadwood, so.
For my money, the best television show ever made.
I'm with you.
And part of the reason it's so good, in my opinion, the essay is called
Al Swearingen is a similarly complex
indeed.
character.
Protecting women by victimizing them. I mean, it's It's there's the writer of that show, David Milch, stole a line from. It might have been from his teacher, Robert Penn Warren, but it might have been somebody else about people who spin against the way they drive. He loves that image, but the essay is called Deadwood's Violent Theological Realism. And the thing I like about Deadwood is that Deadwood inverts the narrative arc of so many of the shows of its time. Instead of taking someone quotidian like Walter White and revealing the capacity for evil in them, right? Of the sort of billowing accumulation of their moral collapse.
Right.
Deadwood starts with people who are only in this place because they've indulged their violence and their avarice, and they've turned their back on polite society and social order. And so it is a crass, obscene, violent place filled with prostitution and gambling and drinking and violence. All the characters in Deadwood, one of the characters, how tolerant of obscenity is your show?
Very.
Okay.
I'm a potty mouth.
So one of the characters in the first episode is sitting at the bar. He orders a whiskey and he says, I may have fucked my life up, flattered and hammered shit, but I stand before you beholden to no human cocksucker, and not the U.S. fucking government, and not the savage fucking red man himself can something.
Yeah.
But I was thinking with that line, I may have fucked my life up, flattered and hammered shit.
Yeah.
This is a guy who has blown his life up and has just accepted it. Right? He pans for gold and he spends it on whiskey, and that's his whole existence. That is a synecdoche for all the characters in the show. And the drama, especially of the first season, is them discovering, despite themselves, community.
That's exactly it.
And social order.
They end up finding themselves in community and caring about the community.
And the best part is there's a preacher in town who does all the funerals, and there's a lot of them. And he always preaches out of Paul's epistles.
Yeah.
And frequently out of Corinthians 12 and 13. And they have no fucking idea what he's on about. But what he's doing is explaining to them what God is doing in their community.
Yeah.
And it's happening despite them. And their lives are all changed for it. And to me, that is the reason why that show, as much as I love The Wire, that's the reason that The Wire is not as good as Deadwood, is because The Wire has good and evil. But it doesn't really have redemption.
Right.
It's truncated in its account of the moral drama of human community.
Yeah.
And so it's unsatisfying. Like season after season after season, you're like, well, I know what's going to happen in the last episode of this season.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens in every season. Because because the redemptive differential in the unfolding of the process is not integrated.
No, I'm gonna have to watch Deadwood again with my son.
Absolutely, I'm always.
My son also loves it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's a great show, and yeah, it's almost kind of the reverse. It's interesting. There's something like that has like the good parts of Calvinism in Deadwood, you know. So because like everybody is like in a state of wretchedness, but they're in that state of wretchedness together, and they build community and
right,
and gradually improve. So
it's that good Marilyn Robinson Calvinist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, I have a lot of Calvinist friends, so I'll give them their props.
You got to nod to everyone's stuff. All right, okay. Yeah. I guess you get a point on that
one. Yeah. All right. Well, Jonathan, this has been great. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
It was a fantastic conversation. I think that we left a lot of unanswered questions, but the nature of what we were talking about, we were bound to. Yeah. I think we were just doing our best to grope toward, at honest, authentic answers, the best we know how, and I think we did a good job of that today. And
it's called the mystery of iniquity for a reason.
Yeah, that's right. And but I think we made some good headway at least today.
Yeah,
thank you for joining me.